Ahoy there, wreck hunters, and welcome back to Wreck Pirates, brought to you by Kraken Charters, a show where we dive deep in maritime history, unearthing the stories of shipwrecks scattered along the coast and beyond. I'm Captain Tom, piloting this episode today, and with me is our Divemaster Ben. If you want to learn more about our crew, head over to KrakenChartersVA.com and click the menu in the upper left-hand corner. There you can explore our scuba diving section to read about the sites we visit, the training classes we offer, and much more. To keep up to date on our episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also visit us on patreon.com for exclusive content. We're your dive buddies, above and below the surface, exploring the wrecks, stories, and skills that make up the diving world of Virginia and North Carolina. Today, we're heading to the Graveyard Atlantic again. Dive 2 wrecks forever linked by World War II, the American cargo ship Santore and the German U-boat 701. These aren't just wrecks, they're predator and prey. One hunter, one hunted. Both now sit silent on the seafloor. The SS Santore was a 7,000 gross ton cargo ship built in 1918 by Bethlehem Steel in Sparrow Point, Maryland. The Santore was a cargo carrier designed to haul bulk goods over long distances and measured 449 feet long with a 57-foot beam. In World War II, the Santore was under charter by the War Shipping Administration, charged with carrying metal ores necessary for the war effort from Chilean mines to North American ports, in exchange for loads of coal.
In the early months of U.S. involvement in World War II, the U.S. coastline was shockingly exposed. Merchant vessels sailed unescorted, often silhouetted at night by coastal lights. German U-boats called this period the Second Happy Time. During this Second Happy Time, German submarines sank 609 Allied ships with over 3 million tons of cargo, while losing only 22 U-boats, and only 5 before June 1942. Officially known as Operation Drumbeat, the operation followed shortly after Germany's declaration of war on the United States on December 11, 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor, and it lasted until August of 1942. The first wave of Operation Drumbeat consisted of 5 Type 9 boats, all leaving from Lorient, France in December 1941. The British Y Service picked up U-boat signals as the boats left the Bay of Biscay. Despite British intelligence picking up these signals and informing the American Navy well ahead of time, the Americans failed to prepare for what was to come.
Victim number 1 sank on January 12th. The Canadian freighter Cyclops was sunk by the U-123, 326 nautical miles east of Boston. Over the next 9 days, 26 more ships were sunk as the Americans failed to mobilize a response. The U-boats cruised along the coast, staying safely submerged through the day and surfacing at night to easily strike merchant vessels that were outlined against the lights of coastal cities. While the Royal Canadian Navy mobilized and saw a decrease in attacks by March, the U-boats continued to run rampant in the U.S. waters, where there was a disorganized and ineffective response from the U.S. Navy. By this time, a second wave of Type 9 boats and a third wave, including Type 7s, had already made their way across the Atlantic. They had begun sinking oil tankers with impunity, attempting to disrupt vital fuel lines for the Allies.
By May, the Allies had begun to organize armed convoys and establish land-based patrols via aircraft. It was under this new threat that the U-701, a Type 7 boat commanded by Captain Lieutenant Horst de Gen, executed its special mission to lay mines in the shipping lanes outside of the Chesapeake Bay. The area was so well protected by Allied mines that an enemy incursion would be considered insane. A 30-mile thick minefield lay as a defensive wall, with only a thin, lightning bolt-shaped channel twisting through the explosives. Wouldn't it be insane to send such a valuable asset into that mess?
Maybe, but consider this. Ships from neutral nations docking in Baltimore were found to have routing instructions for navigating the minefield that were different from those issued by the Allies. Routes to avoid on those papers lined up with where German mines had been found and swept up. Clearly, German intelligence was trading information with neutral nations to the benefit of both.
On its way from Lorient to Cape Henry, the U-701 chased two ships who both escaped, before unloading its cargo of mines right in the middle of the shipping lanes. All 15 mines were dropped in short order. By the time the mines were armed with a delayed timer, the 701 was already operating off of Cape Hatteras. There's more history to unravel with the U-701, but we'll save that for our own episode. On June 15th, the Robert C. Tuttle and the Kingston Selenite had struck the mines laid by the 701 and were sunk. The SO Augusta ran over a mine as well that disabled her engine, and she had to be towed into port. Minesweepers were called in and found all mines except for one. Unfortunately for the crew, the Santore discovered the last mine 2 days later. Captain Eric Nyborg did not see the mine that passed beneath the ship, as it blew a hole in her hull, causing an explosion that blew coal from the holds up to nearly 50 feet in the air. The Santore rolled to its side so quickly that the crew did not have time to launch a lifeboat, and most of the crew jumped for their lives. The ship sunk in less than 3 minutes and was gone by 7:45 a.m. 43 men floated in the sea and were picked up by escorts within 30 minutes. 3 men were missing, presumed to be killed or drowned. Inside of the channel, and proving to be a hazard to navigation after it was hit by the merchant ship Empire Bowman a few days later, the Santore was then blown up by the U.S. Coast Guard.
So for the sinking of the Santore, some things that we could point out is how close World War II was actually to American soil. And a lot of people don't even know that. You always hear people say, well, the last war fought in American soil was the Civil War. Well, that's just not really true.
No, it's not. I mean, World War II was remarkably close to home. And while we don't necessarily have the same scars from the World Wars on land here that we do for the Civil Wars, like, for example, up on the peninsula in the cities of Newport News and Hampton and York County, we can see the scars of earthen redoubts basically carved through the land during the Civil War. We don't have that for World War II, but it was still really close to home. Close enough that there were watchtowers in Virginia Beach where people would go up and watch for U-boats off the coast, like basically within eyesight with some binoculars. And those watchtowers stayed up until like nearly, I think the last one went down in 2007. So with the watchtowers being right there on the coast, it couldn't have been very far away.
No, that's pretty interesting. I didn't even know that. I didn't know there were spotter towers in Virginia Beach. I wonder, did they use anything with Fort Wool right there at the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel? Because, I imagine that'd be a pretty important strategic spot for a wartime effort.
So I'm not sure about a tower on Fort Wool. I think if you drive past it, you can see some structures up today. But some of the oceanside towers were on Fort Story right at the Cape, with it being an important entrance into the bay, and that's where a lot of the defensive mines were laid too. But speaking of that, the Chesapeake Bay is a very strategic location, and clearly it was targeted by the 701 with the Germans making it a very clear goal to lay mines here in this shipping channel.
Yeah, I mean, back then, just as it is today, the Chesapeake Bay is the kind of has some larger ports, right? It's the entrance all the way up to Baltimore to the port up there in Baltimore. You also have the nation's capital that can be accessed up that way from Potomac River. And then here we have we have one of the largest naval bases in the area, with Norfolk, and then not to mention there's 15, 20 other naval bases within a stone's throw. Not to mention the port of Norfolk, we have the port of Portsmouth, and several shipyards and everything. So this area is a hub for shipping activity. Any day you can go out there and see 10, 20 cargo ships or tankers transiting the Chesapeake Bay, whether they're heading west into Norfolk or whether they're heading north up towards Baltimore.
Yeah, I know I see that every day, even when I'm not diving, because I work right down in the shipyard. So, I mean, you see aircraft carriers, you see submarines, tankers. There's a Coast Guard base nearby, so you see those ships too. It's definitely a sight anytime you get on the water.
But yeah, and then you have one of the largest like coal ports, I guess you'd call it, right there just south of the Newport News shipyard where um I mean, if there was ever a war coming towards the US in the future, this is also going to again be a very strategic point. Um where we're going to see stuff happen here in the Chesapeake Bay if that ever came to fruition again.
At least we can rest assured that it'll be heavily fortified.
Well, I mean, speaking of that, right, the lack of the American response back, back then for World War II to these U-boat sinkings, would it be fortified today?
It's a good question. Actually, it really does make you think because that was a major world war. And like I mentioned before, the American Navy had advance notice of the submarines crossing the Atlantic, not just the first five, but like the first 20. So, wave number one, wave number two with those Type 9 boats, the British Navy intercepted their communication signals and told the American Navy that they're coming. They told them their locations, they knew exactly when. And the American Navy still didn't really do anything.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious why that is, or something to read into. I wonder if it has to do with, that bravado of the Americans kind of back in the day, like, oh, we know better, or we didn't get that information, or you guys don't know what you're doing, kind of thing. Kind of curious as to why we didn't make that response. Was it lack of resources here because we all of our young men and older men, all the men really, were off fighting, in Europe. So makes you kind of wonder. But one thing you did mention, I didn't really know that there was the Type 9 and Type 7 here during World War II.
Yeah, so I'll take that question first, and then I think I actually do have an answer to your other question about the lack of the American response and what that was due to. But with the Type 9 and the Type 7 boats, it's pretty interesting because the first two waves were Type 9 boats, and those were designed to be longer distance vessels, and they could, I'm not going to say easily, but more easily than the Type 7s, make the transit across the Atlantic. The Type 7s, on the other hand, they came in that third wave, and later on, when resources were being somewhat depleted, and the Type 7s barely had enough fuel to cross the Atlantic. And what they did is they would have to, stock up the entire boat with provisions because there's no place to get food or water along the way. They would sometimes fill freshwater tanks with diesel just so they had extra fuel to really make sure they got across the Atlantic. And then they would basically hobble across the Atlantic on a single engine, trying to minimize fuel consumption as much as possible. So it could take 3 weeks for them to cross the Atlantic on a single engine like that, but they had to do it because they just weren't designed for those cross Atlantic travels. And then the other thing you mentioned, which was the lack of early American response, I had read about this, and there's two big factors that contributed to the Americans not having a response to those early U-boat sinkings. And one of them is kind of like what you said, is American bravado. So they had the the Atlantic fleet had some ships available. They were mostly deployed in South America and the Caribbean already. What they did have left, very early on, they actually decided to bring troops to Iceland and Denmark as a show of force, as opposed to using them as like escorts in a convoy. And that was an intentional decision. You can read about how the admirals made that decision because they decided that they would rather put on a quote unquote show of force than to run the convoy, to escort the convoy, which was kind of the proven method of the time of defending ships, which is what the British Navy had been doing for a while already. So they made that choice, which turned out not to be a very good choice, and they just didn't use the ships where they should have used them. The second thing is that they were pulled somewhat thin, both in personnel and in ships between the two front wars. So they had the Atlantic fleet that they had to keep in mind, and then there was also the Pacific, and they were getting hammered on that side by Japan and the Philippines and in the Pacific Islands. So between those two things, they couldn't get the resources they needed, and when they did have the resources they needed, they didn't use them as effectively at the beginning.
Okay, right on. The and mine warfare. Uh, I don't know how new it was to World War II. I don't think we didn't really do it in World War One because there wasn't a whole lot of submarines, if I recall. Like we had some early submarines, but it wasn't like something that was relevant here. Am I correct?
Well, you tell me, you remember that from your childhood?
Good one. Um, but since World War II, they have been used in Vietnam, in Persian Gulf, in the Ukraine. But it is being phased out, because my wife is actually a aircraft mechanic in the Navy on the CH-53s, which is the minesweepers, and they are being decommissioned and being removed from the Navy. Um, and I and that's because there's just not really any need for minesweepers these days. And I don't know what technology has replaced those, or if mines just aren't a thing, or they outlawed it by Geneva Convention, something along those lines. But uh, yeah, it's definitely kind of a thing of the past. You haven't really heard too much, except in Ukraine in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it's not super surprising with the rise of drones. I imagine aerial drones would be pretty good at spotting and discharging mines like from the air. And then you even have like underwater drones now. You have companies that do underwater unmanned vehicles that are also designed to like to spot and take out mines. And you see a lot of the kind of future of undersea warfare taking the route of we're going to have submarines. These are very strategic assets, but we're also going to have like unmanned vehicles and have that be a part of our toolbox.
Yeah, there's actually a company. Uh, they're not based out of Norfolk, but they have some boats in Norfolk called Kraken, and they do underwater unmanned drones and surface unmanned uh, vessels. They got a website. Some of those videos are pretty cool. What they can do.
I think that website is Kraken Charters VA, right?
Yes, krakenchartersva.com, and you can go see the mines for yourself underwater, or what's left from the mines.
No, we joke, but it is the same name. A couple different companies. There's a light manufacturer that does underwater light manufacturer, also named Kraken. So popular name.
Can't go wrong with history.
I think the Greek Odyssey names get you too. I mean, those are very popular as a novel that people have to read in high school, and it has that kind of mythical context with it.
So if you want to go diving off the Kraken and you want to see the Santore, we're going to be going out to roughly 60 feet of water off the Virginia coast. It's going to be just west of the Chesapeake Light Tower, and this wreck is broken. It's like a big scrapyard. There's little to no relief. There's no large intact sections of hull, and you wouldn't even know it's a ship, right? I mean, it used to be a 450-foot ship. Now it's just a debris field. The only thing that you can possibly find, and I haven't dove this wreck in several years, there was a gun mount at the stern, and the mast was laying out in the sand. But it could very well since been covered up by the shifting sands from hurricanes and stuff. But it is a place to dive. Your typical dive profile for this site is going to be somewhere around 40 minutes of bottom time. So you can definitely look and try and plenty of time to try and find artifacts. You know, nitrox 36% mix is going to be pretty good for this depth. Marine life is all over this wreck, but it's mostly going to be your smaller fish that you're going to find hiding under the pieces of structure that you find. And you will see some apex predators like amberjacks and sharks roaming around here, and maybe the occasional barracuda. But this dive site is definitely not a mystery. A diver named David Jones recovered the shipbuilder's plaque a long time ago, and so the resting place of the Santore is definitely confirmed.
So let's talk about diving the Santore a little more. You mentioned the gun mount at the stern and mast lying out in the sand, but it might not be there. Can you tell me a little more about how the shifting sands can affect some of the wrecks around here?
I mean, the shifting sands affect any kind of coastal stuff. I mean, the Chesapeake Bay flows billions of gallons of water in and out every day. That those currents cause sands to move and shift. Then you have the hurricanes and the winter storms and nor'easters that can cover up a wreck one year and is barely there, and then the following year you come back and it's 3/4 uncovered. And not so much at the 60-foot depth, but it does happen. It happens more slowly. But our beach wrecks, which um, you know the you have not the triangle wrecks off OBX, which they call down there, which was the Kazikes and the can't remember the name of the other one off the top of my head, but they were pretty much uncovered last year, and then this year there's barely anything sticking out.
Yeah, it's the Carl Gerhard is the other one. Those are probably the two most commonly dove ones. Plenty more though. But yeah, I mean, especially near the beach, and I love beach diving. I love shore diving, and I think some of those wrecks in the Outer Banks are amazing dives. Even having done lots of offshore shipwreck dives, those are great. But yeah, sometimes it's just hit or miss depending on the season. Yeah, wrecks there one month, next month we had a big storm come through, not there anymore. I've seen it offshore too. When I last dove the Byron Benson, which is hour and a half, 2 hours offshore, where you go out there and we're expecting the depth to be like 115 feet, and I drop down there to the sand and it's like 98. We're like, man, this is really covered up.
Yeah, the Byron Benson, that's just like north, I think, of like the USS Jackson down there off Oregon Inlet, if I'm not mistaken. Those used to be. I didn't know it got that shallow um from shoaling or whatever, because I mean that was used to be a pretty deep dive. It used to actually be almost 130 feet. So to hear now that it's 90 feet, it's pretty interesting. So when we talk about that, you can talk about the mix for these dives. Yeah, this dive is when it's 60 feet, 36% is good, because you don't want to max out at 40, because you get down there and let's say more of the wreck's uncovered and now you're at 70 feet or 75 feet. Typically, though, for around here, we're probably not going to do this dive in 60 foot, or maybe a secondary dive. So typically we're going to be running somewhere in 30% so that we can get out to these wrecks that are 120 feet or so.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. You said 36 is a good mix, and 36 is a good mix with the contingency. But you asked me what I'm diving, and I'm diving 30, because if I'm going out on the boat and we're taking an hour and a half or more to get out there anyways, I mean, the Santore is a little closer, but I'm doing 30 just in case we get something a little deeper, a little clearer.
Yeah, the Santore is actually pretty close. It's about a 30-ish minute ride to the Santore. Since it is around that 60-foot depth, it is good for open water divers. Good, but there's not a lot of relief, so it's really easy to get lost on. There's not a whole lot to hook into. So it's not something we would typically dive, even for newer divers, just because there's nothing there. There's nothing for point of reference. And if you've never dove off a boat before, you can't even dive off our boat anyway. But I mean, some other wrecks that are just kind of right, just east of it. You have the tugboat on the artificial reef there for the Chesapeake Light Tower, and a bunch of other train cars and box cars and shipping containers and other debris in that area. That's great beginner dives.
Yeah, that is the good thing about dives like this, is even if it wasn't your first choice, you still get plenty of time. There's still always life to see, and you can still make the most of it, and it's not a far run out. That's a really nice thing as well.
One thing to mention, if you are diving this wreck or some other inshore wrecks, is buddy positioning when you're diving with a buddy. Visibility at these inshore sites, especially the Santore, could be a couple feet, right? Especially on the outgoing tide. And Chesapeake Bay's got some dirty water flowing out. You might be 3 to 5 feet of visibility. So you definitely want to dive in a shoulder to shoulder kind of configuration, or slightly offset. And there's several things you can do to make that a safer dive.
Yeah, I mean, there's the visibility is variable. You go to Florida and you can get 100-foot visibility and you can dive I'm not saying you should, because I firmly believe in buddy diving, but you could do like, I can see them 80 feet away. I'm with the group, but you're not really with the group because you run out of air. You're not swimming 80 feet. So you should definitely at least have a buddy nearby. But Virginia Beach, you don't even really have the luxury of like, oh, I have my eyes on the group. It's my buddy and I are right here. We need to run a line. And that line can be back to the anchor, which definitely, right, you got to get back up. But you may also want to run a line between you and your buddy, because ideally you'd want to be, I like to dive next to each other when you're in a low visibility wreck like this. You can just look over, they're going to be on your right shoulder. You look over, you can do your hand signals. You can see each other's faces. You can do that regulator swap with your hoses. Your hoses are going to be long enough. It's a good position. Some people dive with one buddy like a little further back, a little further ahead. And you can do that too. You could dive in line, but in line, you might have some issues if one of your buddies is a little more foot happy and kicks up some of the silt. So I like side to side a little bit better for that reason. But you might want to run a line between buddies as well, not just back to the anchor line, but between you in case you do get separated. But if you do that, you also want to have some procedures set up ahead of time.
Yeah, because if you can't see hand signals, you can feel rope tugs. You can work that out with your buddy however you want. One tug, I'm okay. 2 tugs, we need to go up. 10 tugs, something's wrong. But yeah, I agree. In lower visibility dives, it's better to be side by side. And honestly, the only reason when you need to be in the front of everyone is if you're guiding a dive, and you can kind of look back and see everyone in a big picture, or in a space where you can't be side to side, right? You have advanced training and you're penetrating a wreck or something, you need to be single file. But otherwise, you should be able to look left and right and see your buddies.
Definitely. And that procedure harkens back to some of the like core principles of diving, some of the core tenets for like how you should approach safe diving in planning. One of those big things that I would stress is planning. So if you're going into a situation where there's potentially low visibility, you got to talk with your buddy ahead of time and establish those signals. Among other things, there's lots of other things you should plan. Do your gear check, plan your depth, your time, your turn back, all of that. And this is just another one of those. How are we going to communicate? Through our hands, through a line if needed.
So join us on Kraken Charters if you want to go check out some of these inshore wrecks.
Yeah, I'd definitely still recommend them. They're good dives, and if you haven't worked your way up to those deeper dives, there's still some really cool things to see, some really cool history, and you might see some amazing sea life as well. There can be turtles, mola sharks on these wrecks, and then some beautiful small fish as well.
The story of the U-701 and the Santore is one of contrast. Hunter and hunted, steel and fire, victory and loss. The Santore now serves a new purpose as an artificial reef and historical monument. The U-701 lives on, at least until our next episode. That's all for this dive into the U-701 and Santore Predator and Prey. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, leave us a rating, and share Wreck Pirates with your dive crew. If there's a wreck you want us to cover, comment on this episode or find us on social media. Until next time, keep your fins on, watch your gas, and as always, where history sinks, we dive. Join us on Wreck Pirates.